In the long and distinguished history of British arms manufacturing, few stories combine technical brilliance, institutional tragedy, and historical irony quite so completely as the story of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol of 1904. Here was a weapon that represented the cutting edge of firearms technology at the dawn of the 20th century, designed by craftsmen at the pinnacle of their art, tested with results that impressed even its most skeptical evaluators, and chambered for a cartridge of genuine power and effectiveness. Here was a weapon that arrived at precisely the right moment in military history, when armies across the world were recognizing that the semi-automatic pistol represented the future of the military sidearm, and were moving decisively to adopt these modern weapons for their officers and specialist troops. And here was a weapon that was rejected by the very army it had been designed to serve, turned away not because of any demonstrated failure in its design or its performance, but because of the weight of institutional tradition, the conservatism of military procurement processes, and a deeply embedded cultural preference for the revolver that would persist in British service for decades beyond any rational justification. The story of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol is not merely the story of a single weapon. It is the story of how great institutions sometimes fail to recognize greatness when it is presented to them, of how the momentum of tradition can override the evidence of testing and the logic of technological progress, and of the costs that such failures exact in the currency that matters most in warfare: the lives of the soldiers who carry whatever their army's procurement system has decided they deserve. This is the story of Britain's most consequential firearms decision of the early 20th century, of the weapon that should have armed a generation of British officers and did not, and of what that decision cost when the guns of August 1914 opened the most terrible war the world had yet seen. To understand the significance of the Webley self-loading pistol, one must first appreciate the context of military pistol development at the turn of the 20th century, and the genuinely revolutionary nature of what the semi-automatic pistol represented. For the preceding 3 decades, the revolver had been the unchallenged standard military sidearm across the world, and the British Webley revolver in particular had established a reputation for rugged reliability and stopping power that was second to none. The Webley Mark I had been adopted in 1887, and subsequent marks had refined and improved the design through the following years, producing a series of revolvers that served the British Army through colonial campaigns on every continent, and that had demonstrated their effectiveness in conditions ranging from the northwest frontier of India to the veldt of South Africa. The Webley revolver was a known quantity, trusted by the officers who carried it, proven in combat across the Empire, and backed by decades of accumulated operational experience. The semi-automatic pistol challenged this established order with a set of technical arguments that were compelling in principle, but untested in military service. Beginning with the Borchardt pistol of 1893, and continuing through the Mauser C96 of 1896 and the Luger of 1900, a new category of military pistol was emerging that used the energy of the fired cartridge to cycle the action automatically, chambering fresh rounds from a magazine without any manual operation by the shooter. These weapons offered higher magazine capacity than revolvers, faster reloading through the replacement of an entire magazine rather than the individual loading of cartridges, and the theoretical advantage of being chambered for cartridges more powerful than the largest practical revolver cartridges. They represented modernity, technological progress, and the application of industrial precision to the ancient craft of pistol making. The Webley and Scott Company, whose revolvers had armed the British Army for 17 years by the time the new century arrived, recognised the challenge that semi-automatic pistols represented and responded with characteristic British craftsmanship and engineering ambition. The development of what would become the Webley self-loading pistol began in the early years of the 20th century, drawing on the accumulated expertise of a firm that had been making precision firearms for decades, and that possessed both the technical knowledge and the manufacturing capability to produce a semi-automatic pistol of the highest quality. The resulting weapon, presented for military evaluation in 1904, was in many respects a remarkable achievement, that reflected the best of British firearms engineering. The Webley Self-Loading Pistol of 1904 was chambered for a cartridge specifically developed for the weapon, and designated the 3/83-inch Webley Self-Loading, a round that would later be more commonly known as the 38 ACP or 3/8 automatic Colt pistol in its American commercial form. This cartridge represented a thoughtful balance of power, size, and manageability. It propelled a bullet of approximately 130 grains at velocities in the range of 1100 feet per second, generating muzzle energy of approximately 350 foot-pounds. This placed the cartridge in the same general performance class as other military pistol rounds of the period, competitive with the 9mm Parabellum that was being developed simultaneously for the German Luger, and superior in energy to many of the smaller caliber semi-automatic cartridges then in circulation. The cartridge was a genuine military round, not a scaled-down target shooting affair, and its terminal performance against human targets was adequate for the close-range engagements that pistols were expected to decide. The mechanical design of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol reflected the design philosophy of a company steeped in the tradition of making firearms for military service in demanding conditions. The operating system used a recoil-operated mechanism, one of the two primary methods by which semi-automatic pistols cycle their actions, in which the force of recoil drove the slide rearward against the tension of the recoil spring. Extracting and ejecting the spent case before the spring returned the slide to battery while chambering a fresh round from the magazine. This system was mechanically straightforward and, when properly engineered, produced reliable operation across a wide range of conditions. The Webley engineers paid particular attention to the tolerances and surface finishes of the components involved in the cycling action, ensuring that the mechanism would function reliably even as wear accumulated over extended service life. The magazine of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol was a detachable box type, inserting into the grip of the weapon in the manner that had become standard for semi-automatic pistols following the influential Browning designs. The magazine capacity was 8 rounds, competitive with the contemporary Luger and considerably exceeding the 6 rounds available from the standard Webley revolver. The magazine could be released by a catch and replaced with a loaded spare in a matter of seconds, dramatically faster than reloading a revolver through the loading gate, or even using the speed loading methods available for top-break designs. This reloading speed was one of the primary practical advantages of the semi-automatic pistol over the revolver, allowing a trained shooter to maintain fire with minimal interruption even after exhausting the initial magazine. The physical quality of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol matched the technical sophistication of its design. The weapon was manufactured to the exacting standards that Webley and Scott applied to all their military products, with careful attention to the fit between components, the quality of the metal used in construction, and the finishing of surfaces both functional and cosmetic. The grip panels were checkered for secure purchase, the sights were clearly defined and appropriately sized for the combat distances at which the weapon would be used, and the overall ergonomics reflected genuine consideration of how the weapon would be handled and fired by the officers who would carry it in service. Contemporary evaluators who handled the weapon described its quality of manufacture as excellent, comparing favourably with the best European semi-automatic pistols of the period. The trials conducted by the British military on the Webley Self-Loading Pistol produced results that should, by any rational analysis, have led directly to adoption. The weapon performed reliably through the standard endurance tests, firing the required number of rounds without significant malfunctions, and demonstrating that its mechanism was robust enough for military service. The accuracy it delivered at the ranges relevant to pistol combat was adequate, and in some respects superior to that of competing revolvers, the fixed barrel of the recoil-operated design contributing to consistent accuracy that the moving barrel of some semi-automatic designs did not achieve. The feeding reliability, always a concern with semi-automatic pistols whose ammunition, feeding from magazine to chamber, was a more complex process than the simple cylinder rotation of a revolver, proved satisfactory with properly manufactured ammunition. The evaluators who conducted these trials were professionally in a difficult position. They were being asked to assess a new type of weapon against an old type that they knew well, in a context where institutional loyalty to the revolver was strong, and where the consequences of recommending a major change in the standard service sidearm were significant. To their credit, the technical evaluation of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol was generally conducted with professional objectivity, and the reports produced by these evaluations acknowledged the weapon's genuine merits. The problems arose not in the technical evaluation but in the subsequent decision-making process, where the weight of institutional preference and the conservatism of senior military opinion overrode the technical evidence. The arguments made against adoption of the Webley self-loading pistol and against semi-automatic pistols more generally reflected several strands of institutional thinking that were deeply embedded in British military culture. The first and most frequently articulated argument was the reliability concern, that semi-automatic pistols, with their more complex mechanisms and their dependence on feeding from magazines, were inherently less reliable than revolvers under adverse conditions. This argument was not without foundation in principle, as early semi-automatic pistols had indeed demonstrated feeding problems with early ammunition and magazine designs, and the failure modes of a jammed semi-automatic were different from and potentially more serious than the failure modes of a revolver. But the argument was applied to the Webley self-loading pistol, based on the general category of weapons, rather than on specific evidence about this particular weapon's reliability, which the trials had demonstrated to be adequate. The second argument was the complexity argument, that semi-automatic pistols were more mechanically complex than revolvers, required more sophisticated maintenance, and demanded a higher level of mechanical understanding from the soldiers who carried them. This concern reflected genuine awareness of the educational and technical limitations of the typical British soldier of the period, and it was not entirely without merit as a consideration in military procurement. A weapon that could not be maintained adequately by the average soldier was a weapon that would fail in the field regardless of how well it performed in controlled trials. But this argument also overstated the complexity differential between revolvers and semi-automatic pistols. The field maintenance required for a semi-automatic pistol was not dramatically more demanding than that required for a revolver, and the specific Webley self-loading pistol had been designed with soldier maintenance in mind. The third and perhaps most revealing argument was the stopping power concern, expressed in terms that reflected both genuine tactical thinking and deep-seated cultural assumptions about what constituted adequate performance in a military pistol. British officers who had served in colonial campaigns, particularly in India and Africa, had accumulated what they believed was definitive evidence that large-caliber revolvers firing heavy bullets were necessary to stop determined opponents who might continue to advance and fight even after sustaining gunshot wounds. The Webley revolver's .455 cartridge was among the most powerful revolver rounds of the period, and officers who had relied on it in close-quarter combat situations had developed strong convictions about the importance of large caliber and heavy bullet weight for stopping power. The Webley self-loading pistol's .383 cartridge, while perfectly adequate by objective measures, was smaller in caliber than the .455 revolver round, and this numerical difference carried disproportionate weight in the debates about adoption. The institutional dynamics that shaped the British military's response to the Webley self-loading pistol extended beyond the specific arguments about reliability, complexity, and stopping power to the broader culture of the British officer class and its relationship with its weapons. The revolver, and specifically the Webley revolver, had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of British military identity, carried by officers across the empire for a generation, associated with the victories and the service that had built that empire. Replacing it with a foreign-inspired design, however Britishly manufactured, represented a cultural disruption that went beyond mere changes in equipment. The semi-automatic pistol, with its continental European associations, its complex mechanism, and its departure from the trusted simplicity of the revolver, seemed to many senior officers to represent not progress, but an unnecessary and potentially dangerous departure from proven solutions. The procurement process through which the British military evaluated and adopted new weapons also contributed to the outcome. The committees and boards responsible for these decisions were composed primarily of senior officers whose experience lay in conventional military operations and whose technical understanding of firearms was practical rather than engineering-based. These officers were well equipped to evaluate weapons based on their experience of using them and seeing them used, but less well equipped to assess the technical merits of new designs that departed from familiar principles. Their judgments tended to reflect accumulated operational experience rather than technical analysis, and their accumulated operational experience was with revolvers, not semi-automatic pistols. The comparison with other major powers' decisions about military pistols in the same period makes the British outcome more strikingly anomalous. Germany adopted the Luger as its standard service pistol in 1908, becoming the first major power to issue a semi-automatic pistol throughout its military. The decision reflected German military culture's greater openness to technological innovation and the influence of technically sophisticated military engineers in the procurement process. The Luger was not without its problems, as subsequent operational experience would demonstrate, but the fundamental decision to embrace semi-automatic pistol technology was well-founded and placed Germany ahead of most other nations in this aspect of infantry equipment. The United States Army adopted the Colt Model 1911, chambered for the famously powerful .45 ACP cartridge, as its standard service pistol in the year of that designation. This decision followed extensive trials that had directly pitted semi-automatic pistols against revolvers and had produced clear evidence in favour of the semi-automatic, combined with the influence of John Moses Browning's design genius in producing a weapon that answered the specific requirements of the American military. The 1911's adoption represented a decisive American commitment to semi-automatic pistol technology that would shape American military small arms practice for the following 8 decades. France adopted the Ruby pistol, and subsequently a series of semi-automatic designs for military use, following the general European trend towards self-loading pistols. Italy adopted semi-automatic designs. Austria-Hungary adopted the Rothsteyr in 1907, and subsequently the Steyr model 1912. Even nations with smaller industrial bases and more limited procurement resources were moving towards semi-automatic pistols as the standard military sidearm, recognizing that the direction of technological progress was clear, and that nations which fell behind in equipping their forces with modern weapons would pay the price in military effectiveness. Britain, meanwhile, continued with its revolvers. The Webley Mark VI, adopted in 1915 during the First World War, represented the culmination of British revolver development, but also its last hurrah, a weapon that was already conceptually outdated when it entered service. British officers who carried the Webley revolver through the trenches of the Western Front did so with a weapon that their German counterparts had superseded years earlier, carrying a heavier, slower reloading sidearm into a war where the close-quarter fighting of raids and counterattacks placed a premium on exactly the qualities that semi-automatic pistols provided. The differential cost of this equipment disparity in individual close combat situations is impossible to calculate precisely, but it was real, and the soldiers who paid it paid in the only currency that cannot be recovered. The story of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol's rejection raises broader questions about the relationship between technological innovation and institutional conservatism that extend well beyond the specific case of British pistol procurement. Every large organisation faces the challenge of evaluating new technologies that challenge established practices, and the difficulties that the British military experienced in assessing the semi-automatic pistol are not unique to that institution or that era. The mechanisms by which institutions resist change, the appeal to tradition, the exaggeration of new technologies' risks, the discounting of established technologies' limitations, and the conflation of familiarity with reliability are recognisable in the weapons procurement debates of every era. What makes the Webley self-loading pistol case particularly instructive is the clarity with which the technical evidence and the institutional decision diverged. The trials had demonstrated that the weapon was reliable, accurate, and well made. The cartridge was adequate for military purposes. The design incorporated genuine engineering improvements over the revolvers it would have replaced. None of these facts were seriously disputed by the evaluators who conducted the trials. The rejection was not a technical judgment, but an institutional one, driven by preferences and assumptions that the technical evidence did not support. This clarity makes the case a particularly sharp illustration of how institutional conservatism can override technical evidence, and a particularly sobering reminder of the cost such overriding can impose. The Webley self-loading pistol did find some users despite its rejection by the British Army. The Royal Navy and the Royal Horse Artillery adopted it for specific applications where its qualities were recognised as valuable, and it saw service in the First World War in the hands of the naval personnel and artillerymen who carried it. These users reported positively on the weapon's performance, providing further evidence that the Army's rejection had been based on institutional preference rather than technical inadequacy. The Navy's adoption reflected a somewhat different institutional culture within the British Armed Forces, one that was perhaps slightly more open to new technology in certain areas, though the fundamental conservatism that characterised British military procurement was present there as well. The post-rejection history of the Webley self-loading pistol includes commercial sales that sustained the design in limited production beyond the initial military rejection. Civilian purchasers who valued its combination of quality, power, and modernity acquired the weapon in the years following its development, and it maintained a presence in the market as a high-quality semi-automatic pistol, even without the large-scale military contract that its designers had hoped it would secure. This commercial existence was a pale shadow of what military adoption would have meant for the weapon and for the company that produced it, but it demonstrated that there was genuine appreciation for the weapon's qualities among those who evaluated it on technical merits rather than institutional preference. The long-term consequences of Britain's rejection of the Webley self-loading pistol and of semi-automatic pistols more generally played out across the first 4 decades of the 20th century. Britain entered the First World War with revolvers, fought through that conflict with revolvers, emerged from it still committed to revolvers, and entered the Second World War with the Enfield No. 2, a revolver that was itself a refinement of the Victorian tradition that the Webley self-loading pistol had offered a path beyond in 1904. The trajectory of British military pistol procurement for 4 decades after the rejection described a long arc of institutional conservatism that maintained the revolver in British service long after virtually every other major military had completed the transition to semi-automatic pistols. The adoption of the Browning high power by British forces during the Second World War, initially by special operations and airborne units, and eventually more broadly, represented the final acknowledgement that the semi-automatic pistol was superior for military purposes. But this acknowledgement came 4 decades after the Webley self-loading pistol had offered Britain the opportunity to make it, and it was made in the context of a wartime emergency that stripped away the institutional inertia which had prevented earlier action. The Browning high power was an excellent weapon, and its adoption was unambiguously the right decision, but it was a decision that could have been made much earlier, and the failure to make it earlier had consequences that accumulated across 40 years of institutional delay. The Webley self-loading pistol of 1904 deserves recognition not just as a historical curiosity or a footnote in the story of British firearms development, but as a genuinely significant weapon whose rejection was a genuinely significant decision. The weapon was good enough to deserve adoption. The cartridge was adequate for military purposes. The manufacturer was capable of producing it in the required quantities. The trials had demonstrated its suitability. All the technical elements were in place for a successful adoption that would have placed Britain alongside Germany and the United States in the vanguard of modern military pistol development. The failure to adopt it was not a failure of the weapon, but a failure of the institution, and that institutional failure is the true subject of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol story. Today, surviving examples of the Webley Self-Loading Pistol are preserved in museums and private collections, where they attract the attention of firearms historians and enthusiasts who recognize in them the combination of quality craftsmanship and advanced design that characterize the best British firearms of their era. Handling one of these weapons, feeling the quality of its manufacture, operating its action, examining the care that went into its construction, it is easy to understand why the engineers and craftsmen who created it must have been confident that their army would recognize its merits and adopt it. It is harder, but necessary, to understand why that confidence was misplaced, and what the misjudgment that produced that misplaced confidence cost in the years that followed. The Webley Self-Loading Pistol stands as a monument to what might have been, to the path not taken, to the opportunity recognised too late. It is a reminder that great institutions are not immune to poor decisions, that technical excellence is no guarantee of institutional acceptance, and that the costs of procurement conservatism are real and human even when they are difficult to count precisely. It is, in the final analysis, one of the most instructive examples in the long history of British military procurement of the gap that can open between what the evidence recommends and what the institution decides, and of the importance of closing that gap before the consequences of leaving it open must be measured in lives rather than in committee reports and procurement delays.